And with all of these issues playing out, you also, your most recent blog at salon.com, and there's a link, by the way, through cspan.org, on the issue of legalizing drugs, some drugs, and you quote Joe Klein, who, out in Time magazine this week, why legalizing marijuana makes sense, and he paraphrases it in terms of the baby boomer generation, one of their last great crusades of those in their 50s and 60s. Is this something that is an agenda item? President Obama was asked about it at a town hall meeting and almost dismissed the question.
Well, I think it's clearly becoming a much more pressing question, and there's a willingness to debate openly our drug policy far more than was true in the past. And the reason is that the American criminal justice system is collapsing on its own weight. Senator Jim Webb from Virginia recently introduced, this week actually, a bill to study criminal justice and prison reform, and he pointed to a statistic that I think all Americans should know, which is that the United States has become the most aggressive nation of jailers in the entire world. We have less than 5% of the world's population, and yet 25% of prisoners worldwide are located in the United States. Huge numbers of them are there for nonviolent drug offenders. We impose the harshest criminal justice penalties of any country in the world. We imprison people for crimes that everywhere in the Western world, in the civilized world, our people are not put into prison for. And I actually am presenting a paper later today at the Cato Institute because in 2001, Portugal, a member of the European Union, had a similar problem that the United States had, an out-of-control drug problem. The more they criminalized, the worse the problem became. The more they put people in prison for drugs, the worse the problem became. And they convened a panel of experts to study the evidence, and what they concluded was the best possible policy approach to enable drug addiction to be addressed by the government meaningfully was to decriminalize all drugs, not to legalize them, but to decriminalize them, so that if someone takes drugs, they're not turned by the state into criminals. And what that enabled was citizens to seek treatment from the government without fear of being put into prison for being a drug addict. And it freed up enormous resources. I mean, we waste billions and billions of dollars on prosecuting and imprisoning and arresting people for nonviolent drug possession. And that money would be so much better put to, for example, funding treatment programs. And in Portugal, ever since decriminalization in 2001, their drug problem has been vastly improved, and their policy, the consequences of that policy are far superior to virtually every other Western nation, especially the ones with harsh criminalization schemes such as the United States and Great Britain.
We're talking with Glenn Greenwald. He's with Salon.com and his regular column, Unclaimed Territory, a graduate of George Washington University and NYU Law School. How did you go from being a lawyer to a blogger?
Well, it's interesting. I was actually reading blogs throughout 2003 and 2004 and found that the level of political discussion there was higher, certainly than what was taking place within our establishment media venues. And essentially I began the blog not in with any plan to become a journalist or a writer, but simply to participate as a citizen in that conversation about what I thought and still think is the radicalism that had been consuming the country. And the advent of the Internet is such that citizens can simply start writing and find a large audience fairly quickly without having to rely upon or go through the large corporations that own our media outlets. And it's really diversified the types and views that are now routinely heard.
We are tracking the tweets on Twitter. Say that 5 times real fast. If you have any comments, you can Twitter us, and we'll get to your emails as well. But we'll go back to the conventional format as well with phone calls. Durham, New York, with Glenn Greenwald. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Greenwald. I'm very concerned about the corporate capture of the media, and I'm sure we're on the same page on that. But I'd like you to talk about that if possible. I'm also interested in the fact that the next guest will be Mr. Brooks, who all of a sudden has seen the light. I suspect that 5 years ago he was actually seeing this light, but it wasn't in his interest to bring the subject up, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think the caller raises a very important point about who it is that owns our major media outlets. I mean, if you look at where most Americans get their news, increasingly it's through diversified sources online and blogs and alternative media, but still overwhelmingly they get them from a handful of large media outlets. And those large media outlets are almost entirely owned by huge corporations that have very specific self-interest in terms of their relationship to the government, in terms of the policies that benefit the financial class, as we were discussing earlier. And so it only stands to reason that if you have a very homogenized set of corporations that control and own media outlets, that the range of viewpoints that Americans will hear from those media outlets is extremely narrow. And you can look issue after issue, from single-payer health care to our blind support for Israel to the idea that our political leaders shouldn't be investigated and prosecuted when they break the law. And what you find is that views that are shared by enormous numbers of Americans, often majorities, are simply excluded, by and large, from our media discussions in these establishment outlets. And the reason is that these are corporate environments with corporate owners, and they have very specific self-interest, and there is not free discussion that takes place within those venues. As far as David Brooks is concerned, I think he's symbolic, though I think that's true of lots of people, is while these policies are being implemented and before it's evident that they are so destructive, we have lots of political pundits and political commentators who support them, who cheer them on. That was, of course, true with the Iraq War and most of the extremism of the Bush administration. And it's only once it becomes so apparent that these policies are so corrosive and destructive do they suddenly stand up and essentially pretend that they were opponents of it all along, and there's very little accountability in the journalism class because of that.
Waldorf, Maryland, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, C-SPAN, for having on such an intelligent guest. It's about time. You got somebody there to tell the truth and talk straight. My question is, number one, where can I get more information to gain a better understanding of who and how these corporations have gained such control? And my second question is, what do you think it's going to take for America to wake up? I mean, in my mind, we're on the brink of another civil war. In my mind, and I don't see how that's unavoidable if things stay the way that they are. I don't understand why it's taking people so long to wake up and realize what's going on. And one last thing, if you could, I've been hearing a lot about this Bilderberg meeting or whatever it is. Can you elaborate on who these people are and what they do and where they're from?
Sure. I mean, essentially those questions are all excellent and actually are quite interrelated. I mean, one of the ways in which our government functions now is that there's very little transparency. I mean, the Bush administration was obsessed with secrecy to the point of classifying even the most mundane details. But even before that, our federal government has been constructing rather steadily a wall of secrecy behind which they can function without any transparency, without the citizenry knowing what they're doing. And most of what takes place in terms of how our laws are written, who's influencing those laws, takes place behind closed doors. I mean, the Federal Reserve has added trillions of dollars to its balance sheet and yet refuses to disclose to whom they've even lent the money. We've transferred hundreds of billions of dollars to corporations as part of our TARP bailout fund, and they simply refuse to account for how that money was spent. And so when you ask, well, how is it that we can learn about who it is who's exerting this influence? I mean, part of the problem is that the government, which is supposed to be transparent and open at its very core, has become almost entirely opaque. And I think in terms of what citizens can do, there's clearly increasing levels of dissatisfaction and even anger among the citizenry, not breaking down between conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, but simply citizens and people who are connected to and inside of the government. And you hear more and more members of the political class and the media elites urging that this populist anger be tapped down and turned off and diffused because I think they're becoming increasingly afraid that their corrupt ways has some limit, and that limit is what the citizenry will tolerate. And unfortunately, it seems that the political class doesn't listen to the concerns of citizens unless they're afraid of the citizenry. And that's why I think that the level of citizenry anger is actually quite overdue and something that ought to be encouraged and I hope continues to increase, because it's the thing that I think is uniquely effective in checking the kind of corruption that we've been discussing.
We've been spending a lot of time talking about the substance of the G20 summit in London. President Obama is now in France. He just wrapped up a news conference with French President Sarkozy, and these are live pictures also from Strasbourg, France, where President Obama is going to begin a town hall meeting, a familiar staple during the presidential campaign. And as you look at this scene in France, Glenn Greenwald, impression?
Well, I think that the promise of the Obama presidency is that it was something that could and still might revitalize the symbol of America as something positive. Our face over the last 8 years, and before that, but certainly the last 8 years intensified it, were things like people in orange jumpsuits chained and kneeling on the ground, being disappeared into CIA black sites, being tortured and kidnapped and disappeared, invading other countries, and there's a perception as well that it's our greed and our lack of effective government that catalyzed the financial crisis. So there's clearly a desire on the part of much of Western Europe, certainly, and I think Latin America as well, for America to once again start to become a force, at least for better, if not for good. And Obama's charisma and the historic nature of his presidency and his eloquence clearly has the capability to change the way that the United States is perceived and to spawn actual leadership in the world. Whether that actually happens, whether there will be meaningful change, I think still remains to be seen.